Hi, we enter into Genesis 29 today as Jacob, in less than a verse, gets all the way from Bethel all the way up here to Haran, which you can see from Google Maps as a long way, hundreds of kilometers, and yet nothing is reported about any struggles along the journey. It's just as if he was walking down the street to stop at the store. So we can hardly imagine that Jacob's journey of 900 kilometers was without any kind of incident. How many days did it take him? What did he eat? Did he have to negotiate with people along the way to find food and places to sleep? But the authors are not interested in that. They were interested in only what we saw in the last two videos, his stopping at a certain place that he called Bethel, and all the elements of Bethel we looked at, and now arriving in the land of the people of the East, as you can see on the left side of the screen. So as we enter into this story, I just want to go over briefly a couple of things we have been looking at in this unit. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this section of 28:11 to 31:55, I really encourage you to do so, where we go over some of these things in more detail. But put simply here, we're in the middle of the second of the three parts of the larger Jacob story, the first part with Jacob and Esau, and the last part with Jacob and Esau, and now we're in this section here, which can be divided in a number of chiasms, as we've been looking at. We're in this first A part of this chiasm that goes through here. And in my notes, I won't show you now, Gordon Wenham, who has a large commentary on Genesis, offers a slightly different chiasm here, but he sees roughly the same one. His goes through all the way end of chapter 31 with one unit. And that's fine. I'm not suggesting that these are the right or the only chiasms. What the chiasms indicate, besides a convenient way to remember where you are in the story without paragraphs and periods and all those kinds of things that we're used to, is the fact that the story is circular in many ways. It goes out and comes back. So here Jacob is going on a journey to this land of the east, but as we heard in the last scene, Yahweh promised him to bring him back safely to the land of his birth. So we know he's going to make a return journey, and that's the second part of the chiasm as he leaves Haran here. But he will not get back easily, as we'll see in chapter 34, after he has a positive encounter with Esau. So, as we've been noting, we've been reading this from at least these three different levels here. The immediate plot of Jacob escaping from his brother and being sent by his parents on this journey, and now he's there. But we also need to look at the two nations in your womb, not so much in this unit right here, but later we'll see, once we get to chapter 30 and the birth of the children, that what we're seeing is the Bible's mythic origin story around Israel as connected to one father, to Jacob as the father, and he will become Mr. Israel in chapter 33. That's over against the other origin stories like we see in Exodus, that they were slaves in Egypt and God's powerful hand brought them out, and other smaller origin stories we see elsewhere in the Bible. But to the extent you think of Israel as consisting of the 12 tribes, the next chapters are where we hear that. But as we noted last time, there's also the post-exilic understanding, and that's what we specifically looked around the Bethel issue. But that's not all. That's the most explicit one, and I noted that here. But other post-exilic issues are, once Jacob gets into the land of the east, how is he going to get out? And that's certainly suggesting parallels to the Judahites taken into exile in the mid-6th century by the Babylonians. And we'll see how closely they're connected with the east in just a moment. So our passage has a series of interesting key words, a set of key words in this first chunk here, plainly around the issues at stake: well, water the sheep, and flocks are gathered, and we see that a number of times, including the curiously repeated with the well's mouth, or the mouth of the well, many times here. So the only other non-human mouth we've seen is the earth opening its mouth to receive Cain's blood Abel's blood after Cain murdered his brother back in chapter 4. So this is the only other non-human mouth. And the second part, once he gets there, we'll see his mother's brother Laban repeated 3 times, just as we saw place repeated 3 times in the last story, really emphasizing what's going on here. That it's not just a man named Laban, but it's his mother's brother Laban. It's repeated so we can hear that. And then in the second part of that, obviously daughters and served, and the issue of maidservant and the 7 are going to be the issues in the getting of 2 wives for the price of 1, so to speak. Although it's not for the price of 1, Jacob's going to pay hard for both of them. Another theme that will emerge in that section, but it really begins to emerge here, and I thank Spolstra for this. Here's the citation to his article. But he highlights a number of elements in common and inversions of the pattern of the wife-sister stories that we saw with Abram and Sarai in chapter 12, with Abraham and Sarah in chapter 20, and with Isaac and Rebekah in chapter 26. all of those stories had these things in common, which are also in common here, even though there's no lie about whether the woman who's perceived as a wife is actually a sister or not, but there is deception from the other side of it. So it'll be Laban who makes the deception, not about her status as wife or sister, but about which one Jacob's going to get. But there are also this whole series of inversions of the pattern, where it's not just different, but it's the opposite. And I won't go over those all now. We'll go over them as we get to them. But one needs to ask the question, why is this pattern here? What is the author saying about Jacob's relationship with his wives that's similar and different with his father and his grandfather's relationship with their wives? So that's, if you'll pardon the pun, a pregnant situation in terms of meaning that we'll have to get at as we go. And then also in this section, now that we're getting to the Laban story, as I noted in the introductory video, and I won't go over it again now, I did more there, I'll be reading this whole unit as an allegory of the monarchy and exile. And here's a number of these parallels. And again, it's posted at radicalbible.net website, so I won't go over them all now. So let's put up our keywords and we'll enter directly into our story. So Jacob went on his journey, which of course he was already on. Literally, as you can see down below, Jacob lifted his foot and went. And that's not a small detail. Yes, it's a metaphor, but we'll see in chapter 33, after the wrestling scene, it says he's limping. And so the question of Jacob's mobility will be at issue here and there. Plainly, he has no problem with mobility here. As Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg quotes the medieval midrashist Rashi on this, Rashi says, since Jacob had been given good news, his heart lifted up his legs and he became light on his feet. As my note below has, the only previous reference to feet in Genesis was the washing of the visitor's feet in chapter 18 and in 19, and then of the Abraham's servant in chapter 24. So this is the only reference to feet that isn't about welcoming strangers with their foot washing. And interestingly, it won't happen here, because Laban will not see Jacob in the same terms as Abraham saw the visitors in chapter 18, and as Lot saw the same visitors in chapter 19. So he went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. And as Sarna notes below, what a glaring contrast between the well-laden camel train of the grandfather and the lonely, empty-handed Jacob who arrives on foot. And that's really important to note, because if we recall chapter 24, which we'll also look at in terms of what scholars call the well-type scene, which is to say a story that repeats itself with some differences, but we expect to know the ending, which is to say marriage ensues. And there's another one for Moses in Exodus. And of course, there's another one that's similar with variation in the New Testament in the Gospel of John chapter 4, when Jesus meets a woman of Samaria at a well. But we won't look at that one here. But as the Septuagint, my note down below further adds, the Septuagint adds here, toward Laban the son of Bethuel the Syrian, brother of Rebekah and mother of Jacob and Esau. So the Septuagint adds more specific detail of where he's going. But the original Hebrew just says to the land of the people of the east. And that's a huge territory. Haran, as we noted with Abram's journey, with his father Terah's journey back in the end of chapter 11, was the farthest western and northernmost outpost of the Babylonian control at that time, which is to say in the 2nd millennium BCE, not the time of the Babylonian Empire at the time of the authors in the 6th century BCE, but at the time of the story world, the millennium later, the original Babylonian Empire. But it's a huge territory, and Babylon, of course, is a long way away. He was directed by his father to go to Paddan Aram and by his mother to go to Haran. But how does he know where those places are, and how would he know when he got there? All that mystery is not here, and the destination is described generically, to the land of the people of the east, literally the sons of the east. And as my note from Michael, whose work we looked at in the parallel with Babel in the last scene notes, there are only 2 places in Genesis where characters are said to have journeyed by themselves to the land of the east, and the other is Lot back here. And so let's look at east in Genesis and see how clearly east is the wrong way. So there are a couple neutral references. The Tigris flows east of Assyria, but that's only sort of neutral, because the Tigris and Euphrates are precisely what define Mesopotamia from the Greek meaning between the rivers. But plainly, at the end of the garden story, the Adam as well as the woman are driven out at the east of the Garden of Eden. So placed in the east, and similarly Cain is exiled east of Eden, made famous, of course, by John Steinbeck's book and the film of the same name. Then in the Tower of Babel story, we hear all the peoples that we saw described in the Table of Nations in chapter 10 as living in a variety of places. But here we have they migrated from the east. They came upon a plain in the land of Shinar. And as my one reference in my note to Michael has reminds us, as we looked last time, to the many parallels with the story of Jacob and his encounter in the dark that we just saw, and the Babel story. So here's another one beyond that, the story that Michael looked at, because our story in the land of the east is also invoking the Tower of Babel story that way. We saw that Abram moved to the hill country in the east of Bethel, but that's not the east. This is just relatively east of that location. So that's not as negative as it is for Lot, who after they separate, Lot journeyed eastward. So he's going in the more generic direction. And of course he ends up in Sodom, which isn't one of the traditional cities of the east. In fact, it's south. And so the eastward here certainly seems to be symbolic, that he's geographically not necessarily east, but he's gone to the mindset of the east, as we'll see. And then similarly we see here in 13, as we saw in 28, the promises to Abram and then the promise to Jacob about, look at the land that you're on and I'll give it to you in all the directions. So that's not negative either. It's just relative to where he's standing. Similarly, in the bargaining for the burial place, the cave is described east of Mamre, and that's just a local reality as well. But here we see an important distinction, that after Abraham has other sons with Keturah, who's described here as a Pilegesh, as a concubine, even though she was described as a wife earlier. But those sons he sent away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country, emphasizing that with a double reference there. And then references in the Joseph story to the east wind, which is also in the Moses story in Exodus, characteristic of the situation in Egypt, where the wind blows from the desert. Notice a couple other perspectives. So consistently in Genesis, we see east is bad, and that's one of the main highlights that the story is composed, at least the version we have, with all these references in the time of exile or after, when Babylon was precisely to the east and was the concern. But in an earlier time period, Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. They're understanding him to be competing as an imperial leader with other imperial leaders. So not a religion of creation story, as I call it, like Genesis is, but putting Solomon's wisdom within the category of other imperial wisdom. But in exilic Isaiah, traditionally known as second Isaiah, but scholars have argued with that in recent years, so I'll just call it exilic Isaiah, the section at least from chapter 40 to 55, if not more, which is basically a pep talk to arouse the people in exile to trust in Yahweh and to leave. And so it's described here as God's rousing a victor from the east summoned to his service. And similarly, a few chapters later, my purpose shall stand and I fulfill my intention, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man for my purpose from a far country. I have spoken, I will bring it to pass. I have planned and I will do it. And he's plainly referring there, as Isaiah notes in chapter 45, to Cyrus, the king of Persia. Persia, not traditionally understood as one of the major Mesopotamian empires with Assyria and Babylon, but it certainly is in modern-day Iran, is certainly someone from the east, and that's obviously what's being referred to here. So in exilic Isaiah, God is using a victor from the east, even though, as we hear in a similar passage in chapter 45, even though he doesn't know me, says Yahweh, it's for a temporary purpose. It's to liberate them so they can go back home. So as readers, we should expect to think, the land of the people of the east. We should have known that before, from when the time they were preparing Jacob to go. But here we hear it out loud. So going back to our key words, and so immediately, and as my note below has, Jacob's engagement parallels Isaac's at 24:12, except Isaac's not in the scene there. In other words, it's Abraham's servant has to be doing it there. So as he looked, and behold, again, I put the beholds in here. It's not a key word as it was in the last scene because it's only a few times, but I put them in here. So if you want to have that, you can download that from the website. As he looked, behold, he saw a well in the field and 3 flocks of sheep lying there beside it. Notice the field, but what field? Where are we? We have no idea where we are in relation. Are we in Haran? Are we in Paddan Aram? We're just in this very vague sense of the land of the people of the east. And I'd like to suggest that's part of the narrative narrator's way of suggesting the implicit presence of Yahweh here in making these things happen. Because out of all the land, he happens to go to a well that, as we'll see in just a couple of minutes, Rachel, Laban's daughter, shows up at, as if on cue. So God isn't said to be directly involved, and correlation is not causation, but it's too precise not to have any reader think God has arranged this in some way, even though the authors don't explicitly put it that way. So as he looked, he saw a well, and this is the last well in Genesis. He left from Beersheba, which is 7 wells, and interestingly, this one well is mentioned 7 times in this immediate scene, as you can see counted here. So whether that's a coincidence or not, you can decide. He saw a well in the field, and 3 flocks of sheep. Why there are 3 flocks? Only to suggest it needs 3 shepherds. And so we aren't told how many shepherds there are, but that's the implication there. 3 flocks of sheep lying there beside it. So they're already there, ready to be watered. But we have to hear something more happening here. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone in the mouth's well was large. And notice the narrator has omniscient knowledge here. Not only can he name what is seen, what any reader or observer can see, the 3 flocks of sheep lying there, but he knows that out of that well the flocks were watered, and he knows what we hear in verse 3. Then when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back on its place in the mouth of the well. So the narrator gives us this in-depth perspective on what the scene is, and anticipates the problem that Jacob is going to face, which is to say, to get the shepherds out of there so he can be alone with Rachel without having all the shepherds there to take the stone off the well and back. And it implies, as you can see from this one image of an ancient well with a stone on it, that stone might not look that big, but you try to pick up a big round stone and see how strong you are. And we don't know how big this well is, but it's big enough to be the main watering place for all the shepherds of the region, although we don't know how big the region is, and we don't know where it is in relation to Haran. So the stone on the mouth's well was large, we hear, as my note has below, a detail setting up Jacob's feet. F-E-A-T, not F-E-E-T. Anderson, who wrote a wonderful monograph on Jacob in this story, notes that Gadol, the word for large or mighty here, is used to describe Leah in verse 16, such that both are obstacles for Jacob. Leah will be described as the large child, or the major child, as opposed to the older child there. As Sarna notes, the stone restricted the use of the well to a closed group, and outsiders are required to pay for water. At the same time, the cover would serve as protection against dust and filth, and as a guard against accidental fall by man or beast. So a very practical reality here. So again, let's look a little more closely at the verse that we just jumped over here. So when they were gathered there here, the word, which is hard to pronounce without the vowel in the form it is here, it's von esfu, but it's related to the etymology for Joseph, and we'll see a number of those as well. Joseph, the root of Joseph, asef, literally means added, or one more, so to speak, but this is also another one. So the shepherds here, setting up that detail, we already noted that, would roll the stone away, and that's repeated a couple times here, and it's only one other time outside this scene. And so, with that in mind, we hear Jacob speak. And as Westerman notes, it is not the narrator's intention to contrast the different characters of Jacob and the herdsman. He is looking rather to the narrative as a whole, and is already indicating the contrast between the greeting of the reserved and somewhat mistrustful foreigners and that of the relatives. And I would extend that further and say not somewhat mistrustful. Here they are going about their daily life, and a total stranger has shown up and is referring to them as brothers, which they have no reason to think he is. He doesn't identify himself at all. You'd think that would be the starting point. He'd say, I'm a stranger from far away, but I have family here. But instead, he just starts questioning them. And they have a good reason to say, go F yourself, or whatever would be the colloquial version of that. We don't need to talk to strangers and give away information. So they should be very suspicious, as we saw the residents of Sodom were, of the divine visitors. They didn't know were the divine, that Lot led into his house. They were so upset that all the men of the city surrounded Lot's house to demand that they come out. And so here's this stranger, not yet in the city, but outside the city by the well, and they will respond to him in short 1 or 2 word responses in the Hebrew, but I'd suggest, contrary to Westerman, that they're somewhat mistrustful, that they're being incredibly magnanimous under the circumstances. So he refers to them as brothers here, and as Westerman again notes, nothing more than an endeavor to win goodwill, which I think is exactly the point. He notes it's parallel to Lot's expression of the visitors back in chapter 19. It will contrast with the true brotherhood repeated 3 times in 29:10 of Laban and Jacob at the other side of this first part of the chiasm. And so they said, we are from Haran. It doesn't say where Haran is in relation to this. As in any urban context, the shepherds in the fields would be away from the city, outside the city, but we don't know how big a town Haran is at this time or how big we're supposed to imagine it is. It's just simply a named place. And he said to them, do you know Laban, son of Nahor? A very direct question here. And the answer is we do. Notice how they ignore Bethel, Laban's actual father, who will be referred to, which would be the polite way to refer to it, but he doesn't necessarily know that. Neither his mother or nor father have told him about that, although you would think they might have mentioned his grandfather or his great uncle at some point, but we don't know that. Yerzakovich argues in my note below that Laban, quote, was indeed modeled after the cruel figure of Pharaoh, and the Exodus from Egypt left its mark in our chapter, and he offers a series of parallels. But I'd suggest that he, although he's an excellent reader, he didn't go far enough to see it's not just parallel to the story in Egypt with Pharaoh, but to all of them, including Abimelech. So Spolstra's insight, I think, goes deeper there than Zokovich's does. And they said, we do, or literally we know, as short an answer as possible. And then to the very end of what we're going to do here, he said, is it well with them, literally shalom. Is it shalom? And they say shalom, giving a one-word answer. And behold, here's his daughter Rachel coming with the sheep. And how perfect is that? It could have been that, yeah, we know Laban and his shepherds will be here soon, or we're not going to tell you any more about that. But here comes the shepherd daughter, Rachel, we'll find out in a minute, coming with the sheep. So that's the setup for our scene. I'm stopping what appears to be the middle of a paragraph, but we'll go next time from Jacob's feat of response to his first encounter with the woman he loves, making the only kiss in the Bible between a man and a woman who aren't married. We'll see you for that exciting scene next time. Bye-bye.